So I turn to Julian. So Julian, we know that the Assad regime in Damascus is Russia's key political ally and partner in the region. What could be the impact of the war in Ukraine on the conflict in Syria? And how will the Ukraine war affect Russia's strategic and military role in the MENA region?
Thank you, Valeria, and very nice to be back with you. So I think the honest answer is we don't know, and that there's huge uncertainty about how this will play out going forward. There are clearly a lot of immediate impacts in terms of food security and the kind of positioning of regional states that Maha is going to come in on. But I think Syria is an interesting microcosm of some of the dynamics at play here, because I think the obvious answer is to assume that the war in Ukraine, the tensions between Russia and the West will lead to a deterioration of the situation in Syria, that Russia is likely to play more of a spoiler role, that we risk a Russian veto of UN Security Council resolutions to allow cross-border aid. We risk the Russians using pressure like refugees to exert pressure on the West and try and extricate themselves from the situation in Ukraine, and we risk a wider collapse in diplomacy between the West and Syria. And obviously the idea is that this will strengthen Assad, this will make it even harder to reach any kind of solutions. But I think we really don't know how this will play out. Russia is obviously very focused on the situation in Ukraine and in Syria and elsewhere in the region where it's involved, whether it's Libya, whether it's a JCPOA and the nuclear deal, where we saw some risk of a disruptive Russian role, but that now seems to have been rolled back. We may actually see the opposite happening. We may see that the Russians are overstretched, that they have to pull out resources out of places like Syria, Libya. They have less bandwidth for issues like the JCPOA. We see that they are not going to want to get sucked into a crisis. They are not going to want to manage a new eruption of tensions in Idlib if humanitarian aid stops going in. They are not going to want to manage the fallout of a collapse in Western aid via Damascus if the Russians don't play ball on their aid. We also see that the Russians probably need to appease some of their own allies. We saw this on the JCPOA negotiations that ultimately it seems that kind of the Iranians were able to go to Moscow and say to them, look, we want this deal, stop disrupting it. And I think that the Russians are going to face similar pressures in Syria in terms of the role of their ties to Turkey. They're going to have the likes of the Emirates whispering in their ears, pushing them not to be disruptive there and provoke more instability. So, yes, it could get bad. Yes, this could result in a collapse of diplomacy and kind of the cross-border aid resolution in July could be made problematic. But at the same time, maybe the Russians want to keep a lid on this. Maybe the Russians want to keep a lid on provoking new problems in Syria or Libya or on the Iran deal, simply so that they can focus on managing the dire situation they are in at the moment. One thing I think that is very clear is the dire impact that this is going to have on the Syrian population in terms of food insecurity. This is something that we'll probably talk about right across the region. Ukraine, Russia, a real breadbasket for much of the Middle East. Syria was already in a catastrophic situation on the humanitarian front. You have 12 million people in need. A spike in food prices is really going to prove catastrophic to a population that is already so desperate, where there isn't enough international focus. And I think that's really one area where we need to ensure that attention remains fixed, even as, particularly in the West, we look towards Ukraine or elsewhere. And so, and it points to a bigger issue. Does the West get so consumed by the crisis in Ukraine and Russia that it diverts attention, political focus, economic resources that would be used to try and fix problems in Syria and Libya or elsewhere in the region. So those are some initial thoughts, but let me end as I began by saying it's really the early stages here, and much depends on the way that Russia wants to play this in terms of leveraging or not its regional position to try and create problems or not.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Julian. You raised many important points, and we will talk extensively about this. Now, I'd like to turn to Nimrod to talk about the position of Israel. Israel, which is a major player in the Mena region, and it has maintained good relations with both Ukraine and Russia. And it is among the few countries that are trying to play a mediation role between Moscow and Kyiv. So let's try to understand more about Israel's position vis-à-vis the two countries and vis-à-vis the conflict. So, and the question is, what can we expect from Israel mediation efforts? I mean, what leverage can Israel use vis-à-vis Russia? Nimrod, please.
Thank you, Valeria. Pleasure being here. First, we have to take into account that what is happening in Ukraine, beyond the political and humanitarian issue, for many Israelis, it's a personal issue. Many Israelis have family there, or have friends there, or have people who are fleeing both countries. So it touches upon a very sensitive nerve in the Israeli public. There is a general sentiment of sympathizing with Ukraine and supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity, but we do see a division of labor between different people within the government. For example, while Foreign Minister Lapid is very clearly calling against the Russian invasion, Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister, is very cautious from even mentioning Russia in any manner. So there are different approaches within the Israeli government, basically because Israel is trying to go between the lines. Russia is important because of Israel's actions in Syria against Iranian targets and the need to maintain freedom of action there. Does that legitimize more concern of Russia's interest? I'm not sure, but that's what the government is doing in practice. And in terms of Ukraine, of course, there is a moral issue, there is a geopolitical issue, there's being on the right side of history. It's about liberal democratic values, and it's about aligning with our Western allies. So these are kind of the calculations shaping both sides. And Israel's intervention on this conflict could be assessed on different levels. First, on the multilateral setting, then on the mediation, which you mentioned, and then also within the public debate domestically. Because on the multilateral level, Israel first did not want to engage with the American proposal at the Security Council or to endorse it, but later on it did vote with the Americans and others in the General Assembly and even helped to mobilize countries like the UAE, which abstained at the Security Council. Yet Israel is not supporting the sanctions and is not wanting to pitch in on that. Israel does mediate. It's a very new thing for Israel to mediate in a conflict of others. In the past, there was some sort of outreach to Israel in regards to other conflicts, but Israel denied that. And now Naftali Bennett, as Prime Minister, is going back and forth from Putin to Zelensky and speaking with other leaders in the world. That's a new phenomenon. It means that Israel's foreign policy is trying to go to a new level. Whether that will be successful, I'm not sure. It's definitely a legitimizing factor for the some sort of neutrality that Bennett wants to play. It's being closely coordinated, maybe even initiated by Chancellor Scholz, but also coordinated with Macron. And a big question mark within the Israeli debate is how much are the Americans on board? Was it being initiated after a green light from the White House, or did the Americans join the game only later on? The message from Washington is it's all coordinated, but that's still out there to look. And maybe a final point is how all of that plays domestically, because it does spark a conversation in Israel about absorbing refugees, not only the ones who are Jewish or have relation to Israel. It's a moral issue. It's how much Israel is taking part in the global agenda. How much does its foreign policy become an internationalist one? How much is it willing even to give Zelensky the floor to speak to the Knesset members, which was debated and eventually will take place on Sunday. So while trying to mediate, we see Israel slowly moving into the more pro-Ukraine camp, cautiously, but that's the right thing to do. And Israel's foreign policy should be much clearer, much more siding with Ukraine, criticizing the Russian actions, while doing as much as it can to try and help this conflict to at least be moderated or maybe even stopped.
Thank you very much, Nimrod. And now let's turn to Michael. And we said that one of the first effect is on food supplies, on cereals and wheat. So as Russia and Ukraine combined account for more than a quarter of global wheat exports, the prices of global commodities have hiked as a result of the war. So how this war, how will affect food security in the Middle East and North Africa? And which countries of the MENA region are most vulnerable to higher prices and disrupted wheat supplies? And how they can cope with such a challenge? Michael, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to have everyone understand exactly where we are. And to do that, we have to go back to June 2021, because in June 2021, the level of food inflation in the MENA region reached the same exact level as the buildup to the Arab Spring a decade ago. So that was all the way back in June 2021. The MENA region was in a severe food crisis. In the last 6 months of 2021, that severe crisis became a perfect storm because of supply disruptions, because of the mismanagement of COVID-19, because of severe weather events driven by climate change, and the hoarding of grains by certain countries, particularly China. So what do I mean? If we go fast forward to September 2021, you asked me about wheat. The price of wheat was $271 per metric ton. That is a 22% increase from September 2020, a year previously. Now, that perfect storm with Russia's invasion of Ukraine became a tsunami. So in the short time, if we go just last week, the price of wheat was $468 a ton. That's over the previous 271, meaning an additional 73% increase. Now, when we think of the vulnerable states in the MENA region, obviously Egypt comes to mind first, because it was the high bread prices that were responsible, that helped topple the Mubarak regime. The Arab Spring was about dignity and justice, but what sustained the protesters on the streets were soaring food prices back then, in the face of systemic corruption and misgovernance. So now we have even a double situation than we had back then, and Egypt has 105 million people, the largest population in the MENA region, and it is the largest wheat importer in the entire world. Not even just the MENA region, the entire world. And Egyptians consume twice as much bread as the global average. So that bread is subsidized, the wheat for that bread is subsidized by the Egyptian government for 88% of the population, and that costs the Egyptian treasury $3.3 billion a year. That was with the old price. Now the price is almost double. So for Egypt, this is budget-breaking prices. But here is where good governance matters. because the Sisi government has spent the last 7 years trying to put Egypt's economic house in order, and they don't want to make those same mistakes again from a decade ago. So very cleverly, the Egyptian government that was very proactive on this, in November 2021, there was a small price dip when the Omicron variant of COVID-19 appeared. Everyone was afraid it was going to be a new wave of COVID, and the global markets were afraid that demand would drop. So the price had a quick plummet, and Egypt jumped on that opportunity and bought 600,000 tons of wheat at bargain basement prices. So that's where a visionary, proactive government can make a difference. So the threat is severe in Egypt. It is existential. It is not just wheat, it's cooking oil, it's many things. But contrast that to Lebanon, where this time around, Lebanon, I think, is one of the most vulnerable countries. And not just because Lebanon is in a state of hyperinflation with its terrible economic meltdown that is seen since the start of its economic crisis. Food inflation has increased 1,000%, and 3/4 of Lebanon's population lives below the poverty line. So even if Lebanon could somehow afford the wheat at these prices, the other issue, it's not clear that they could even get the wheat and get it on time. And why? That's an issue of storage capacity. So if you remember the infamous 2020 Beirut port explosion, well, that explosion destroyed 75% of Lebanon's storage capacity for wheat. Why? Because the storage silos were right there at the port, and they have not been rebuilt to this day. So Lebanon has only 1 month's worth of storage capacity, and that is by taking the flour mills around Tripoli and storing wheat in their warehouses. So Lebanon is on a 1-month time clock before this crisis happened to replenish its wheat. Now they relied on Ukraine for 2/3 of that wheat every month. And the reason is the Black Sea is relatively close to the Eastern Mediterranean. So it only takes 7 days for a wheat ship carrying a wheat cargo to arrive from Ukraine's ports to the port of Lebanon's port of Tripoli. So now those deliveries have stopped. And so this 1-month time clock is ticking. And Lebanon is talking with the US, with Canada, so even India, to replace those. But because there's travel time and shipping routes, it takes 25 days for wheat to get from the United States to Lebanon. So what that means is they could miss the time clock. Lebanon, simply put, Lebanon could run out of bread. And so countries like Lebanon, I think if you want to put another country in distress, I would say Tunisia. I can give you my list. These countries need immediate stopgap assistance. But obviously, most of the countries in the MENA region need to transform their agricultural and water capacities. And I can talk about that in the next round.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. In the meantime, I've been informed that unfortunately, Mahayaya and Carol Neckel had some technical problems. We are working to reconnect with them, but we are not sure to succeed in these efforts. So we continue to talk with our guests, and I would like to invite the audience to send their questions in the webinar chat. So let's back to Julian. Julian, you already mentioned the Iran, the nuclear issue, but we would like to go more in depth on this. Iran is among those countries that abstained in the UN General Assembly vote, trying to maintain a neutral stance toward the conflict and while asserting at the meantime that the war is rooted in NATO's provocations. So we would like to understand how is the war in Ukraine and tensions between Russia and Western countries affecting the negotiation on JCPOA in Vienna. So, and what perspectives?
Sure. So in the first instance, I think that the war in Ukraine did risk derailing a negotiation that appeared to be reaching the finishing line. Effectively, negotiations between the Iranians and the US have more or less been completed with a text on the table. Negotiations of which the Russians were active and constructive partners. And I think it's been very interesting that even as tensions have escalated over Ukraine over recent months, there has been a continued US-Russian dialogue on the JCPOA. But at the last minute, and in response to international sanctions on Russia, Moscow seemingly put new demands on the table, saying that they would only sign up to a new agreement if all its trade and investment with Iran was excluded from sanctions. And this was something that the West wasn't prepared to accept. The French talked of blackmail and saw this as a way to try and get out of international sanctions. And so for a moment, it did appear that the deal was threatened with collapse. And I think it was interesting to see a couple of things from the Iranian perspective there. On the one hand, Iran continued to blame and attribute kind of lack of progress to the Americans. And I think this reflects the fact that ultimately, whatever the fate of the JCPOA, Iran is not going to break with Russia. I think Iran has regional concerns related to the strategic posture of the US, of Arab Gulf states. Moscow is in the end an ally that it has much greater trust and alignment with. And I don't think it was prepared to actively break with Russia and say that this is unacceptable and we want this deal to go forward after a year of negotiations. But you did see the Iranian foreign minister going to Moscow in the last couple of days. You saw some signs of unease coming out of Tehran about this Russian position, and Russia seems to have now walked back its demands and effectively said that we were only talking about sanctions relief related to elements directly associated with the deal. And so now it seems that the negotiations are seemingly back on track. A deal may be close. Iran wants this deal. It's invested a lot in trying to construct a negotiation that it can sell at home domestically as a win, as a better deal than the Raisi government would have secured. I don't think that's true, but ultimately it wants the sanctions relief, and it's not prepared to walk away from that. But it has had to go to Moscow, talk to them, and perhaps the Chinese also had a role in trying to get Russia back online. And it points to the kind of threats to multilateral negotiations, UN processes in which Russia is a partner right now, and the way in which tensions over Ukraine could play into that. The hope is that the kind of degree of compartmentalizing that we're seeing on the nuclear deals may allow for some constructive progress on these other issues. As I say, there's also the rollover of the Syria sanctions, Syria humanitarian aid into Idlib. There's also a Libya sanctions question. So these are some of the dynamics at play at the moment. And why don't I leave it at that?
Thanks a lot, Julian. Very, very clear. And now we turn to another important regional player, Turkey, that is trying a lot, along with Israel, to play mediator, to play as a mediator. And during President Erdogan's recent visit to Turkey, which marked an important shift in bilateral relations, Erdogan also discussed about the war in Ukraine with President Erdogan. Today, Turkish Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu is in Moscow, and then he will fly to Kyiv. So I would like to ask to Nimrod, what leverage can Turkey have vis-à-vis Russia? And do you think that if Israel and Turkey will join their efforts, their mediation could be more effective? And last but not least, how difficult is Turkey's balancing exercise between Ukraine and Russia? Please, Nimrod.
So all of this happens in a very unique time for Israel-Turkey relationship. After many strained years, we saw quite an historic visit of President Herzog to Ankara, very welcomed warmly in Turkey, signing a new chapter towards a new chapter in the relationship. And interestingly enough, the two countries are finding themselves in quite a similar position when it comes to what's happening in Ukraine. While, as I mentioned before, for Israel, it's quite new to try and mediate. Turkey tried to do so in the past in different conflicts. About a decade ago, it was put on the table as quite a central pillar of Turkey's foreign policy as a mediator state. And we saw from the onset of this crisis in Ukraine, weeks before the Russian invasion, that Erdogan, when he visits Ukraine, offers already to mediate. And then throughout February, inviting Putin to Ankara, initiating all kind of possible meetings between the sides. That only took place recently in Antalya with the meeting between the Ukrainian and the Russian foreign minister. So Turkey is trying to play within this mediation role. And like Israel, it's also a way for it to try and balance. It's legitimizing the balancing act that Turkey is doing. And Turkey is balancing. You asked about the ability to leverage over Russia. So Turkey-Russia relations are very important. Erdogan stated very clearly that Turkey is not giving up on either. While visiting Ukraine, supporting Ukraine, selling weapons to Ukraine, the Bayraktar, the drones, Turkey and Russia relations are deep. It's going on wheat, on gas, on tourism, on security, on what happens in Syria and ramifications for Turkey. We saw the crisis between the states in 2015 after the downing of the Russian jet and what implication it had on the Turkish economy. So Turkey is trying to play in between. And again, how much of a leverage that will have in practice, not clear. There is multiple actors on the international agenda trying to mediate. In Turkey, it goes in line with this new diplomatic era that it tries to open up with different neighbors, notwithstanding Ukraine. We saw Erdogan going to the UAE. We see dialogue even slow with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia. We see what's happening between Turkey and Armenia, the visit by the Prime Minister of Greece. So all of that kind of creates an attempt by the Turks to reshape their regional relationship, and mediating in the conflict in Ukraine could be seen by Western allies as an asset both to NATO and both to these efforts, and maybe improve a bit Turkey's positions in their eyes, which was not that good just a few months ago.
Thanks, Nimrod. Actually, you highlighted the important shift in Turkey-Israeli relations, which mark also a shift in regional dynamics. So I'll turn to Michael and to ask him to what extent might food insecurity intertwine with other pre-existing problems in the MENA region. I mean, climate change, water scarcity, and lately the COVID-19 pandemic. And how all this can affect the economies of the MENA countries.
Right. Thank you, Valeria. As I said in my previous remarks, we were already in crisis in the MENA region, and we were already at a very severe crisis that went over the top, that accelerated with Russia-Ukraine crisis. But even if this crisis gets resolved, now Ukraine and Russia are talking about a 15-point plan and Ukrainian neutrality. Even if it ended tomorrow, the MENA region is in severe will still be in a severe crisis. The MENA region is facing severe water stress across the region, and so is Southern Europe, almost the same level of water stress. And this will affect all the supply chains, food supply chain, and it's an issue of food, water, and energy. These things are interconnected in one nexus. And you take the example of Tunisia. Tunisia doesn't have enough food. It doesn't have enough water. 80% of its water is used for agriculture. But it's, again, an issue of good governance. Tunisia does not have a government to take care of its needs. So, for example, 50%, up to 50% of the water in Tunisia, as it tries to get to homes, is lost before it reaches the taps in people's homes. The dams in Tunisia are silting up because of climate change, so they do not have water. 2020, they had 1.1 billion cubic meters in their dams. That was down in 2021 to 730 million cubic meters. It's a severe crisis. And the answers ultimately are going to be renewable energy. The answer ultimately is going to be desalination powered by renewable energy and green agriculture, green hydrogen, green ammonia, green fertilizer. And the country that is leading the way, that is a global trailblazer in this, is Morocco, not only with the largest solar power facilities under construction right now, but Morocco is also the 5th largest fertilizer producer in the world. So let me explain, because you can't feed a country without fertilizer anymore. That's just it. No country, and all the countries in Africa and even North Africa, have to raise the use of fertilizer. Well, fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer, which what you use to make wheat, 80% of the cost is natural gas, because natural gas is not only used to power the processes, natural gas is what you make the nitrogen out of, the nitrogen fertilizer out of. So, so ammonia is nitrogen and hydrogen. So, and you need ammonia for fertilizer. Now, the price of gas in 2021, before the Ukraine crisis, as you well know, because you pay your bills at home, the price of gas in Europe went up 400%. So Yara, one of the biggest fertilizer producers in the world, had to shut down factories. Factories were shut down in the UK with other countries. That sends the price of fertilizer sky high. That sends the price of cereal grains sky high. And then that sends the price of pork, beef, and poultry sky high, because all those grains are used for animal feed. So it's this cycle. Like, for example, Italy will feel if the Ukraine crisis continues, Italy will feel the impact in 4 weeks, because Italy gets its feed from Spain, and Spain gets the corn to produce the feed from Ukraine. And it's just going to take 4 weeks to work around. So ultimately, the long-term solution would be not to use natural gas, but to use renewables, both as an energy source, because if you take desalination for water, desalination requires 10 times the amount of water as the conventional water treatment that's used when you get your water out of the tap. So 10 times the amount of energy is used for every liter of water. So that can only ultimately in the long run come from renewables. Similarly, green ammonia. Now, Morocco is using solar energy for desalination, and they are one of the global leaders in green ammonia. They have 3 different projects. The largest one, 2 with Germany, and the largest one with an Ireland headquartered company that's going to produce 183,000 tons of ammonia just from electricity and water and the air. With no harmful byproducts. So that right now is equivalent to 10% of what Morocco needs for its global fertilizer industry. And now they can scale it up. In fact, they can scale it up to the point where they could export to Europe. The commodity company Vitol has already signed an MOU with Morocco to export and trade in the green ammonia. So the answers are there. What they need are two things. Obviously, tremendous capital investment. So Morocco, for example, I'll finish in 1 minute. Morocco has a national water plan from 2020 to 2050 for irrigation, dams, desalination. And the cost of that plan is $40 billion. So to solve the problem, it's going to take a lot of money, but it's going to take investments. And this is where there are many soft power opportunities for the US, Canada, Australia, and Europe. Immediate stopgap measures help the MENA region prevent a crisis. And then long-term, win-win joint venture investment partnerships. North Africa doesn't need another green colonialism. They don't need to be the green battery of Europe. They should be able to have partnerships in which North Africa can fuel itself, feed itself, create value-added production, and then interact with both Africa and Europe. And if Europe is the lead partner in that, or the United States and Europe are the lead partners, well, this would be a tremendous soft power and also help change the global connectivity in the world. And so we need to see this now in the context of the Global Gateway Initiative, because even though the focus right now is obviously preserving Ukraine, preserving highly at-risk countries like Moldova, it is a global contest right now for how connectivity is going to be structured. And there are tremendous opportunities for genuine win-win partnerships. People throw around the word partnership loosely, but I mean mutual, beneficial, reciprocal win-win partnerships. And the time to act for Europe and the United States is now.
Thank you, Michael. You raised many points. I agree that renewables is the future, as you highlighted. It needs a lot of investments. However, we are still very dependent on oil. Today, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia to ask to pump more oil, and which is the point now for European countries to look for energy alternatives, to diversify their supplies and to reduce their dependence on Russia. When you talked about the risks, the crisis, the economic crisis as a result of rising prices in food supplies, I was wondering if we will witness a new wave of protests in the region, in the most vulnerable countries like Lebanon. What about this scenario?
Yes, I'd like to say also this is where I think Europe, just to pick up on your comment, Europe is now having a more realistic gas policy. The gas cannot stay in the ground. It needs to be a bridge fuel. It needs to catalyze the use of renewables, and that's something research that I've been working on. In terms of answering your question about vulnerable states, the key here is states. Let me put it this way: let's take Egypt. Bread is like a social contract. Everybody knows esh baladi. It's the flat, round bread. Getting that at affordable price is a social contract. Now, Sisi has been trying to reduce subsidies. He was very good at reducing even vegetable oil subsidy. But this is a tough one. But what I think the issue is where you see high levels of grievance with the government, and whether the government is popular or not, it's also the government's effectiveness in action. So as long as the Egyptian government stays effective in action, they can manage the risk. Now, effectiveness in action also depends on foreign assistance. It also depends on the flexibility of the International Monetary Fund. For example, if there needs to be more government spending, countries are going to have to renegotiate those caps with the International Monetary Fund. But take countries where there is a high level of grievance, a high level of dysfunctionality and distrust, and that is an explosive cocktail. And we saw that directly south of Egypt over the weekend in Sudan, where from Sunday to Monday, bread prices went up over 43%. And there were massive demonstrations on the streets. Tear gas was fired. So, Julian mentioned Syria. Now, Syria is extremely vulnerable. Again, already 71% of the people were in high food distress, and that's not even including the refugees. 2 days before, or the day of the Russian invasion, there was a big convening at the United Nations about this topic, and they issued a severe warning. So again, Syria is in great distress. Lebanon is in great distress. Now, of course, Syria's economy depends on Lebanon. So the more distress Lebanon is under, the more distress Syria is going to be under, because Syria depends on Lebanon's banking system. Sudan, if you go in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia was the largest dependency on Ukrainian wheat, even more than Egypt. So the whole Horn of Africa, if we go a little further afield, and Tunisia is highly vulnerable. Algeria is also very weak, and I don't think that the increased revenues from hydrocarbons is going to help that much, because the crises are systemic. So I think, again, it's a good governance issue. And Tunisia, I would also mark as a case, because the problems that are currently there with Kais Saied, and effectively who is running the country, this kind of paralysis that has I can't say Tunisians are fed up with it. It's beyond. This is what they were against with the Arab Spring. Don't forget, it was food that initiated Mohamed Bouazizi he was a fruit seller. And so I think Tunisia is highly vulnerable, but at the same time, it's about 10, 11 million people, very close to Europe, obviously very close to Italy. There's a lot Europe could do for an impact. You're talking a country 10 times smaller than Egypt. The other case is Libya. Now, if it weren't for the Russia-Ukraine war, we would all be meeting here today talking about Libya. Libya is on a knife's edge. We see the same thing, two governments again. Bashagha can't even go to Tripoli. We would be having another international conference, and we'd be talking about Turkey and Russia setting the agenda. It is entirely off the radar screen. And that is a replay of 2014, right? Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea in 2014, and Europe didn't have enough bandwidth to deal with things falling apart in what historians call the second phase of the Libyan civil war. So Libya is also one of the countries most dependent on Ukrainian wheat. So Libya, Tunisia, Lebanon, Syria are highly, highly vulnerable. And the Gulf states have very deep interests in Ukrainian agriculture. So while they might not be vulnerable, some of their vital interests are going to be very adversely affected.
Thanks a lot, Michael, for this wide picture. Now we have received some questions from the audience. There is a question from Laila. She asked, what do you think should be the priorities of European development cooperation in the short, medium, long run to lessen the impact of the war on the MENA region? I turn this question to Julian.
Well, I think there's two immediate priorities. One is the challenges that are going to emerge from the huge surge of food and energy prices. That's obviously going to spill out very painfully across the region, a region that, as Michael has already been talking about, is already hollowed out under the pressure of these challenges. So I think an immediate priority is thinking about how Europeans can step in to help fill that gap, whether it's sourcing food, whether it's financing food, whether it's procuring supplies. There's a huge issue there that needs immediate addressing, because we're really, as Michael again said, the region is at a knife edge. We risk pushing it over the edge into a deep new crisis if this is allowed to spiral out of control. I think the second issue relates to some of the political dynamics and crisis points across the region. This is perhaps not something for development ministries, but clearly there is a need to ensure that Europeans remain focused on these regional crises. Libya, as was just being discussed, requires urgent international attention. Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, these are all places that if the international focus drifts away, are liable to be sucked into to kind of negative trajectories that accelerate some of the worst outcomes that are spiraling, that are feeding threats to European interests. I mean, this also relates to the food crisis. For a Europe that is concerned with migration, for a Europe that is concerned with kind of ungoverned spaces and the way that anger and local disenchantment fuels kind of radicalism. These are threats that need to continue to be addressed. In many ways, kind of Russia and Ukraine is a strategic threat facing Europe most immediately. But I think it's a crisis. It's the ground level crises from the Middle East and North Africa that have most profoundly impacted Europe over the last decade, and I don't think Europe should lose sight of that in the moment going ahead. And I just add one last point. I think there's going to be a tendency. Or a risk, I should say, of importing the conflict with Russia over Ukraine into the Middle East, whether that's in Syria, whether that's in Libya, whether that's on the nuclear file. And I think Europeans need to look, where possible, to compartmentalize, I won't say cooperation, but at least coordination on getting some productive steps forward. So that means, yes, securing the JCPOA. That means trying to get a rollover of a UN resolution to get aid into Idlib. I think it's critical that the Europeans look to preserve space for any kind of multilateral action working through the UN that can help alleviate these pressures that we've all been discussing.
Thanks a lot, Julian. And talking about energy and energy supply diversification, I would like to ask Nimrod, in your opinion, may the risk of cuts, if there is any, in Russian supplies to Europe give renewed impetus to projects like the EastMed pipeline?
We've heard recently about the decisions regarding the EastMed pipeline by the Americans, and also reflected by others. I think this project was overplayed along the years. It did enable all kinds of diplomatic and geopolitical alignments to happen, like the EastMed gas forum and other initiatives and alliances, but the practical aspects of this pipeline seems to me to be quite unfeasible, and I don't think this is changed. The new alignments within the region may lead to new thinking about ways to supply gas to Europe. It could be through LNG with Egypt, perhaps also a shift more to the renewables, so natural gas important per se, but looking into new regional mechanism, and it relates also to the rapprochement between Israel and Turkey, and the wish also from Turkey to cooperate with Israel on energy, with the Israeli interest not to jeopardize its alliance with Greece and Cyprus and Egypt for the benefit of the new ties with Turkey, and the approach to look for something new, some mechanism in the East Med which is inclusive in nature. It goes in line with the EU intention to hold an East Med inclusive conference that did not happen yet. It goes in line with the Israeli president's vision for a renewable Middle East. It also includes the East Med. So perhaps we are talking not about reviving the old ideas of the pipelines for natural gas, as much as those are needed now by Europe, but looking into a new structure that goes beyond the current crisis and try to bring the different countries within the East Med, perhaps not only the East Med, because now Israel is also working with Morocco and countries in the West. Perhaps it could be a bit broader, looking into environment, climate change, renewable energies, into a new sort of a win-win cooperation. Again, that won't be the solution to the question that you're asking, but I think in the long term, it will be much more beneficial, at least for our region.
Thank you, Nimrod. So maybe in the medium term, there could be some prospect to include Turkey in some regional kind of cooperation in energy issues. This is a question to you and to Michael. What do you think?
Well, I can start. Look, there is, since 2015, 14-15, there were serious discussions about an undersea pipeline from Israel to Turkey, from the Leviathan field. The market logic was there. I know the Turkish energy industry, people that were involved with it. The market logic was there in 2015. The market logic is there now. I don't think Turkey should ever replace Russian natural gas for its own supply because it's an important relationship, but they can reduce the dependency. So when Turkey is not substituting LNG, they use somewhere between 45 and 55%, 45-55 BCM total. So they get like 36, let's say, from Russia, something like that, 38, maybe more some years. It goes up and down. Well, now they're getting the Tana pipeline, which goes all the way from the Caspian Sea through the Caucasus, through all the way across Turkey. It's the SPX, the Southern Caucasus pipeline extension, the TANAP, then to the Trans-Adriatic pipeline from Greece, Albania to Italy. Endpoint is Italy. That's now, that is 16 BCM, 10 goes to Europe, 6 goes to Turkey. That pipeline has the capacity for 60 BCM. Now, Turkey could replace, if you look at some of the main suppliers, you have the Kurdish regional government could be attached to that pipeline. Ultimately, you have at least 10 BCM that way. You could easily have 20. If you take the sour gas, the estimates, a recent serious feasibility study said 35. That enough would replace it. Then you add Israeli natural gas, right? So let's say 8 BCM to be conservative. But you could maybe even ultimately increase that to 16. So you see how the numbers are going. And then if you ever get Turkmenistan gas, well, then it's game over into that pipeline. So the logic is there for East Med cooperation. And as we heard before, the rapprochement are in place. Turkey, Egypt, Turkey, Greece. I mean, we just saw Prime Minister Mitsotakis and President Erdogan. There is a new tone from Ankara. Look at what's happening with Turkey-Armenia reconciliation. Armenia just said it can reestablish relations with Turkey. Obviously, you already alluded, Valeria, to the landmark visit of President Herzog to Turkey, the first time in 8 years. And then, of course, the rapprochement with the UAE, which is critical in this mix. So it's very clear that there are arrangements where gas could go to Turkey, profits and extra gas could be siphoned off to Cyprus. There are ways to work out win-win cooperations. I have my own proposal that I'm going to publish very soon. And we could foresee maybe Turkey joining the East Med Gas Forum. And there's also a difference. Turkey has its own gas from the Black Sea. So the situation is quite different. And now where minds are focused on realpolitik because of the Ukraine crisis in a way that had never been before for like the last 5 or 10 years. So I think the situation is quite in flux. Minds are concentrated. And so the opportunities are now to create that win-win cooperation regionally across conflict lines that has stakeholder interest. It can start with gas, but I'd also argue there's tremendous potential across the Eastern Mediterranean for renewable energy cooperation. And as we know, there's actually a conference happening in Morocco between Israel and Morocco about agri-tech, water tech, green energy. So yes, what Nimrod said is correct, that since the Libya crisis, we've seen the Eastern Med and the Western Med become more integrated than they ever have been before. So we really Europe should be looking at Mediterranean-wide solutions, all kinds of innovative cross-cutting solutions that, let's say, involve clusters of nations. That includes the clusters of EU nations, the Med South, or now the Med, it used to be Med 7, it's Med 9 with the Balkan countries in there, and countries that have the technology and the interest. So Germany with Siemens and other corporations can play a great role. And what I see now is that there shouldn't be a line dividing the North Mediterranean and the South Mediterranean. There shouldn't be a line dividing the East and the West. And now I think is really the ripe time for East Med cooperation, but that could even expand more broadly.
Thanks, Michael. We get almost to the end of our discussion, but there is one more question from the audience that I would like to address to all of you very, very quickly. What, if any, are the implications for China in the MENA region with respect to the war in Ukraine? Would like to answer first. Julian.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the landscape is clearly changing, and we haven't really talked much about the hedging that we've seen from regional states. They haven't fallen into line behind Western calls for condemnation of the Russian move, or if they have, they've done it slowly. And I think this reflects a sense on their part that they can't rely solely on the US for core security guarantees. They are looking to diversify in one sense, to create space for the likes of, or drawing more on the likes of Russia and China to balance their needs. Obviously, China is a key energy importer. All this being said, I think let's not overstate things. You know, the Americans remain the overwhelmingly dominant player in the region. And I think undoubtedly there's a playing here on dynamics in which regional actors are trying to suggest that they're looking more towards the East and the Russians precisely to draw the Americans back in. And so, yes, look, there are great power dynamics playing in the region. The Chinese are growing out their role. Regional actors are engaging with them more. But much is still in the kind of American court in terms of whether they are going to pull out more substantially and whether they're going to respond to this call by regional states to stay engaged at the level that the likes of the Saudis and the Emiratis would like, in terms of backing up efforts in Yemen or kind of playing down some of the criticism on human rights and other dimensions. And we've seen that. I mean, Biden has reached out to MBS and the Saudis in a way that he hasn't done for 3 years now. And this is the realpolitik that is emerging out of the crisis.
Thanks, Julian. Nimrod.
Yes, I agree with Julian. I think we see it, especially with the Gulf states, how they are kind of looking more eastwards. But again, the presence of the US in the region, And we spoke before about the Mediterranean, the East Med. And that's a place that American diplomacy should be invested, not only from an economic point of view. We saw in the past the business interest affecting US policy, but recently we saw more diplomacy, the mediation between Israel and Lebanon, and otherwise. If we are looking into these inclusive modalities that Michael was mentioning before, as also as a counter reaction to a possible intervention by the other global actors. One country that was not mentioned in the list of countries with which Turkey is doing rapprochement is Cyprus. And basically Cyprus is a key to the pipeline from Israel to Turkey. Another issue, I don't think that economic modalities or benefits to Cyprus will be enough to enable a gas flow from Israel to Turkey. So whether the Americans or the Europeans or both as part of this new neighborhood, Southern Med agenda of the EU or elsewhere, want to impact the realities in the East Med, I think now is the time to pay attention to Cyprus, because that's one of the conflicts that the parties themselves are not successful in reaching a breakthrough through. So Greece and Turkey and Israel, Turkey, Armenia, all are doing the work on their own. Cyprus needs mediation, needs intervention. I know the attention is now elsewhere on Ukraine, but also in the context of China and Russia's role in the East Med, I think the West should invest more in looking for ways to move forward on the Cyprus issue.
Thanks, Nimrod. And now, Michael, for a last quick comment.
Yeah, so I'll leave Cyprus alone, although I've written a lot about it. I'll never get to China if I talk about Cyprus. I agree with Julian about the bargaining, but I add another perspective. In December 2019, I wrote a report called The Middle East Year of the Dragon Bear, meaning Russia and China. And it was off by a year because of COVID-19. So what we see is China and Russia's plan to say, wait a minute, the US shouldn't be in the center of the strategic architecture or the security architecture. There should be a more pluralistic center. It's not like China and Russia have an immediate plan to kick out the United States. They want to knock the United States off its central role. And I say Russia and China because they don't even have to work actively together. They can even have their own agendas, that passive synergy between them that rewrite the rule sets of the Middle East. And that's what we've seen happening, where both China and Russia say, well, no, we're going to broker both sides between, let's say, Iran and the Arab Gulf states. You remember 2019? I'm sure Julian remembers. Putin came to Saudi Arabia and he was feted like a czar. And MBZ said, Putin is my brother and Moscow is my second home. Then now it's Xi's turn. Xi Jinping is now in Saudi Arabia. But what we see here is on many levels. The economic level, and it's way beyond the oil relationship, but also the security level. The US said no ballistic missile program for Saudi Arabia, right? We'll give you Patriots. Well, the Saudis then turned and started developing a covert ballistic missile program with the help of China. So we see these gaps. And to give you an example, we know that Iran conducts annual naval exercises with Russia and China. China joined those. But what is less noticed is before that happened the first time in 2020, China completed a 3-week naval exercise with Saudi Arabia right before. So China is seeking to insert itself both economically, both in terms of security, to widen the space, not necessarily immediately knock out the United States, but let's say to remove American centrality from the Middle East. And Europe needs to pay very careful attention to that and decide what is going to serve Europeans' interests the best.
Thank you very much, Michael. So at the end of the day, we will witness greater China's role in the region. So we get to the end of our discussion. Thank you very much, really, thank you very much for your precious contribution to this insightful discussion. Thank you to the audience and see you next time. Bye-bye. Have a nice evening.